The world of Bitcoin has always been enamored with cults of personality. Not to suggest that Michael Saylor sits at the center of a cult intentionally, but I do think that are people looking at him as another coming of some like a Satoshi level figure? I'd say like that's perhaps fair. I don't think through any necessarily fault of Saylor himself. I mean, in terms of where this Treasury strategy goes, I think it's an open question. When you see comments out there in the ether of, well, this is an infallible model, it can go on forever. I mean, this line has been said across the Bitcoin and crypto space again and again and again.
Michael Saylor saying that
Every cycle.
Yeah,
what's
every cycle we have something like this. Now, is that to suggest that these treasuries are going to implode one day? Like, I'm not saying that. I'm not sophisticated enough, but I see a few things going on here. I see that there is a level of financial engineering here that is genuinely interesting. I think there is a lot of evangelizing and narrative building happening around that. And I think that narrative building is where you create some level of risk and potential vectors for attack. I mean, at the end of the day, these are people who are selling a story. And like Wall Street has been selling stories for as long as Wall Street has existed. So when I hear, oh, well, this is about the democratization of money and the replacement of the dollar, like that could very well be true. But I also am very aware that I am being like told a story in order to perhaps induce me to purchase something, which again is just what Wall Street does. I think, a number of years ago, a kind of collective decision was made to tilt the industry in the direction of Wall Street and financial types, like perhaps more than it was like earlier in its history. And I think that, will there one day be a kind of reckoning for that? I don't know. But I do think that that choice was made. And I think that the corporate treasury strategy is at this point in time the ultimate reflection of that sort of quasi group decision to say, well, we've been trying to do payments for many, many years. It hasn't really caught on. Like there isn't a ton of adoption here, but this store of value, like what are the manifestations of this? And I think what's happening now, it's genuinely very interesting. And I think you're seeing a lot of companies look at this to see a way to potentially engage investors with their stock. And again, like by buying Bitcoin, it gives them something to tell and a story to sell that they haven't really been able to. I mean, think about GameStop. I think GameStop is a perfect example of this where like what's the reason to buy GameStop stock? Like, if you've been to a GameStop recently, they're not very nice stores. You don't really need to go to them unless you're trying to buy like nerdy merch. Otherwise, their selections kind of suck. You can just buy these games online. But by having a Bitcoin treasury strategy, there is now a new reason to be interested in GameStop, which ultimately has nothing to do with their core business model. Again, I'm not trying to cast like a moral aspersion on this, but just to say like what is happening at like a behavioral level and to acknowledge that this is kind of a thing. So is it sustainable in the long run? I think I've been around crypto to say long enough that I don't know for sure if all of these companies are like quote unquote going to make it and whether this strategy will help them achieve the objectives they want. But when you see a lot of people running into the same room, all chasing the same idea, which again ultimately is to give them something new to tell to their investors, I think it should perhaps be a cause to pause and say, like, what are we trying to do here? Is there a gap between what's actually happening on the ground and like the gap happening in the narrative? And I think that the Bitcoin/crypto space has always been very susceptible to either comforting or thesis affirming narratives. And I think it's just important to acknowledge that